Great, Daniel, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I never thought I would learn about turtle distributions, but it was great to be able to see that. I've been asked to talk about the roles and responsibilities of various entities for promoting research integrity. If we go to the next slide, I want to start by telling a story which many of you may know. Next slide. This goes back to January of 1981. At that time, I was, no, previous slide. January of 1981. And at that time, I was about to start medical school. This was an article that it was the lead article in the New England Journal of Medicine, decreased myocardial taurine levels and hypertaururia in a kindred with mitral valve prolapse and congestive cardiomyopathy. It's a rather remarkable paper by two authors. The first author was named John Darcy, who at that time was at Emory University. And they had claimed to essentially have found a new disease by studying several dozen people within a family and collecting a whole lot of information and specimens about them. You'll notice that there's also on the paper that this was supported by a grant from the U.S. Public Health Service. That this was an NIH supported grant. Well, Dr. Darcy at that time was considered to be a shining star in cardiovascular research. He went to a prominent institution in Boston. And one day he was doing an animal experiment with dogs. His colleagues noted that he was writing down the results of the experiment, even though the experiment hadn't happened yet. This was an experiment that was going to supposedly going to take place over several days. And here he was writing into his lab notebook all the results of the experiment. And they thought that was kind of strange. This started then a whole cascade of events. So if we go to the next slide, which then led to discoveries that, next slide. Yeah, which then led to previous slide. Which then led to discoveries that he had fabricated a lot of work. So in this particular case, this paper was retracted because the work had been fabricated. It says here that he had fabricated data from several publications. It wasn't several publications. It was dozens of publications. And it led to there was a lot of news coverage. There were investigations and more investigations. It was a huge scandal. Go to the next slide. So at the time that the scandal came out, there was an editorial that was written by Arnold Relman, who at that time was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. The editorial was called Lessons Learned from the Darcy Affair. And he said a number of things which arguably would still be true today. The academic system afforded him an opportunity to fabricate. There was some kind of inner pathology in place that a clever cheat is difficult to expose. The peer review system is not a way to detect cheaters, although maybe it is. We'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the key problems here is that the supervision within his research operations, including the one at Emory, as well as in Boston, were rather loose. And then another big problem was co-authorship. There were prominent people who were co-authors on papers that actually were works of fiction. And you've got to wonder what roles and what degree of oversight did they play. Okay, next slide, please. So that's 1981. Now we'll go to a more modern story, which is 2006. And this is one that I'm guessing nearly all of you know about. This involved a researcher named Anil Pati. He was at Duke University, and he claimed to have discovered a way of coming up with molecular signatures to describe prognosis and response to therapy in various types of cancers. This was considered to be a major breakthrough. This is one of a number of papers that he published in which he claimed that you could use genomics to refine prognosis and potentially define treatment. So if we go to the next slide, this generated an enormous amount of excitement, and so much so that, of course, other cancer institutions were interested and wanted to use the technology, including people at MD Anderson at the University of Texas in Houston. So Keith Baggerly and Kevin Coombs are mathematicians, statisticians who obtained data on cell lines. These were cell line data that had to be shared. That's an important point here. That was involved in Anil Pati's work, and when they were really trying to understand what Anil Pati was doing. Not that they were suspecting anything, but because they just wanted to know what he was doing and potentially apply that to their institution. They discovered all kinds of problems that just weren't making sense. This particular paper, which came out in the Annals of Applied Statistics, suggested that there were just mistakes, sloppy mistakes that had been made, but these sloppy mistakes may have led to misleading conclusions. There was a lot of back and forth that went on for quite a while. And then in 2010 or 2009, a peer reviewer at NIH happened to see Dr. Pati's biosketch and said, something here looks funny. He claims to have won a Rhodes Scholarship. Well, he didn't win a Rhodes Scholarship. And he claims to have worked in a prominent laboratory in another country. Well, he hadn't worked in that laboratory. So that then opened up a whole cascade of events. If we go to the next slide. And the whole thing then completely fell apart. And this is now a year later, an article that appeared in the New York Times, how bright promise in cancer testing fell apart. 4 gene signature papers were retracted. Turned out that this was falsified, fabricated data. Duke shut down 3 trials. Now, that's a big issue here. There were people with widespread cancer, very ill people, who were enrolled in clinical trials that were based on false pretenses. Dr. Pati resigned from Duke. His collaborator and mentor, Dr. Nevins, no longer directs one of the Duke's genomic centers. The cancer world is reeling. There was also a company that had been set up that had been disbanded. This was a horrendous story. Okay, next. Now, there are some differences between this story and the John Darcy story. One is that this dealt with complex data. So this is something that this particular audience would very much appreciate. Complex data may not be so intuitive what kind of results you'd expect to see. Another issue here is that data sharing, there was some data sharing that was required here. And this started to lead to a recognition that there was a problem. There have been a number of research misconduct cases that broke open because of data sharing, and that may be an important avenue that we will have. Peer review actually did play a role here. There was a peer reviewer who noticed something funny, and so that brings up the idea of a confluence of sins. Somebody who commits one kind of sin is likely to commit others. So somebody who fabricates or falsifies research data may also embellish their CV or their biosketch. There was real harm here. Patients were enrolled in trials. This is different from the Darcy case, but still, this took many years to uncover, and a clever cheat is difficult to expose. Next. So now we're going to go to an even more recent, this is just from a few years ago, a couple of years ago. This is a case that I was peripherally involved with. Multiple claims of misconduct involving Duke University. And what was different here was the idea that it wasn't just the researcher who was being held accountable, it was the university. So there was a rodent asthma lab, and they had fabricated data on numerous papers and numerous grant applications. This led to a $112.5 million settlement because of multiple episodes of research misconduct at Duke. The president of Duke University said that this is a difficult moment. This case demonstrates the devastating impact of research fraud and reinforces the need for all of us to have a focused commitment on promoting research integrity and accountability. So this is now an important point. It's not just individual scientists, it's a bigger issue. Next slide. The U.S. Department of Justice issued a press release at that time, and the United States Attorney who was involved in this case said that taxpayers expect and deserve that federal grant dollars will be used honestly. Individuals and institutions that receive research funding from the federal government must be scrupulous in conducting research. In other words, making sure that the information that appears in grant applications and and government-funded research papers is true is not only an issue for the individual scientists or their laboratories, it's also an issue for institutions. Next slide. All right, and there are more stories. So here's a story from Boston. This involved Anversa, Piero Anversa, who had falsified data involving cardiac regeneration, and this led to a retraction of papers. And there are lots of stories. So let's go into the next slide. I think one of the key points here is that over time, thinking about as we have evolved from Darcy to Potty to Anversa and the Duke settlement, that the vocabulary has changed. This is a very interesting paper that was published maybe a couple of years ago now. Perceptions of research integrity climate differ between academic ranks and disciplinary fields. There's some fascinating work here and fascinating data about how various instruments were used to measure what you might call the research integrity climate. This is now something that can be quantified or semi-quantified. But the reason why I'm bringing this out is something that appeared in the early text of the paper. Breaches of research integrity have shocked the academic community. Initially, explanations were sought at the level of individual researchers, people like John Darcy or a variety of other names. But over time, increased recognition emerged of the important role that the research integrity climate may play in influencing researchers' misbehaviors. In other words, it's not only researchers who must be held accountable, but it's also institutions. Go to the next slide. And in fact, this is critical because in our vocabulary, the NIH vocabulary, we work with institutions. So this is our NIH grants policy statement. It's a document that we put out about once a year. But one of the key points here is that we make awards to institutions. We do not make awards to scientists, and it's the institutions that are ultimately responsible and accountable for the award. So if you go to the next slide, so this illustrates, we give the award to the organization. So NIH gives awards to organizations, the University of A, the University of B, and then the organizations in turn employ scientists, PIs and staff scientists and postdocs. So we act as a funding steward, and we work with organizations in partnership as a funding steward, and then in turn organizations work with their employees as employer stewards. Okay, next. So as part of this, recognizing this, back in 2018, we issued this guide notice that recipient organizations need to communicate research misconduct to the NIH. Now, what this means is that if there's serious reason to believe that there is misconduct going on in a laboratory that's being funded by NIH, we do need to be part of that discussion. Now, obviously, it needs to be discreet, confidential. We need to respect due process. We need to recognize that that not every case of alleged scientific misconduct turns out to be real. But on the other hand, in order for us to function as effective stewards of taxpayer money, we do need to be part of this conversation. And in some cases, grant stewardship actions do need to be taken, even if we don't yet have formal findings. Okay, next. All right, so I'm now going to switch gears. And up until this point, I've talked about classic scientific misconduct, where classic scientific misconduct would include fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. We in fact deal with a variety of different types of misconduct, and those include not only standard research misconduct, but also sexual harassment. I saw there was a sexual harassment headline that just popped on my phone just a few minutes ago. Grant fraud, foreign influence, and peer review integrity violations. we, on a high level, approach these in very much the same way. We do our own initial assessment, and then we may take a variety of actions. We may contact the institution. We may remove an individual from peer review service. We may work with other agencies, ORI, OCR, OIG, on other agencies as well. We may take administrative actions, such as suspending or terminating a grant, and we may take regulatory actions as well. Okay, next. So let me now talk about a different kind of misconduct. And this kind of parallels standard scientific misconduct. This is a peer review. So here we had a case of a scientist who was based at the University of Kansas. And somehow he got a hold of an application that had been submitted from a researcher at Harvard. And then he plagiarized that application. So this is kind of standard scientific misconduct. He plagiarized it and then submitted it under his own name. ORI worked tirelessly on this case. And if we go to the, just hit the button again. So it turned out he had plagiarized the work of a Harvard Medical School doctor, and when it was discovered, it turned out that that he had plagiarized the work, and this eventually led to a debarment for this particular scientist. Okay, next slide. All right, now the next case doesn't fall into classic scientific misconduct. This is a strange email that was sent to one of my colleagues in the office of the Center for Scientific Research at NIH. This is the, let me try that again. The Center for Scientific Review at NIH, or CSR. This is the part of NIH that reviews most of the grant applications that we get. So this was a person who was on a review panel. And he sends a note to his scientific review officer. It says, I received a call from an R01 applicant who asked me if my grant proposal is in my hand. I refused to answer. Then another person who was on the study section called me and asked if the same grant proposal is in my hand. I refused to answer. Indeed, I am one of the reviewers. I have never encountered this problem before. How should I deal with it? And of course, why this reviewer was so confused was he thought this whole process was confidential. And the fact that he was reviewing an application that was going to be discussed at an upcoming meeting was not something that the PI was supposed to know about. So if you go to the next slide, not only that, but this PI had sent email. So this was an email that was sent from the PI to a reviewer who was sitting on the panel. It says, hi there. I need your help, you know where. And the key thing is that this note was sent before the meeting actually took place. Again, the reviewer was quite frightened by this because he thought that this was supposed to be all confidential. How was it that this PI knew that he had been assigned to review his application? So next slide. So it turned out what had happened was that one of the reviewers had, another reviewer, had shared login credentials with this PI. And therefore, the PI, using the login credentials of a reviewer on the study section, was able to see the preliminary critiques. He was also able to see who his competition was. He was able to see the other applications. So now the other reviewers who had been contacted by the PI did the right thing, and that they contacted us, CSR, to find out, let us know that there was a problem. And then it got even worse than that, because it turned out that that reviewer who had shared the login credentials had actually invited another one of the reviewers out to dinner and said, I need to talk to you about how harsh you were on this particular application, and I have some comments for you that you might want to see. So the whole thing was completely stunning. We had sharing of login credentials, sharing of confidential information. Person was essentially attempting to tamper with the peer review process as it was happening. What I am happy to say is that we contacted the VPRs of both institutions, the institution of the reviewer who shared the login credentials, as well as the institution of the PI, who then got hold of all this information that he had no business seeing, and also attempted to tamper with the peer review process. And both of them lost their jobs. Both of them were either terminated or forced to resign because of this egregious breach of peer review rules. Okay, next. All right, another peer review problem, which then segues into the last kind of integrity issue I want to talk about. So this was MD Anderson, and this is from the cancer letter. This came out, I think, in April of 2019. And it turned out that there were some weird peer review issues going on there. So hit the button. So yeah, there were R01 applications that were emailed to China. There was a scientist there at MD Anderson who was on one of our peer review panels, and despite the fact that he had certified that he was going to keep all materials confidential, what he was doing was he was emailing confidential applications to other scientists in China who now could see what American scientists were thinking about. Okay, and hit the button again, and again. Okay, so this was a reviewer who sends this email to a PI from a different institution, but this is a PI who's submitting an application that's coming into the study section he's sitting on. And I'm not going to read it, but it's a rather it indicates that there is a personal relationship between this reviewer and the PI. The reviewer was male and the applicant was female, and what the reviewer did was he got a hold of this application ahead of time. She sent it to him. He helped her write it, and then when the application came in and he was sitting on the study section, he didn't declare himself in conflict with this application that came from a PI whom he had a relationship with, and that also came from an application that he himself had helped write. Okay, next. All right, so just keep hitting the button until this slide fills up. So this brings up the last item I want to talk about, which is that we've now are dealing with issues where because of the nefarious actions of foreign governments, in particular the government of China, a number of our scientists are engaging in unethical behavior. On the left is Moffitt Cancer Center. There were 6 scientists, including the CEO, who had signed contracts with Chinese institutions without anybody knowing about it, without Moffitt knowing about it, without NIH knowing about it. There were clear-cut conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment that had not been disclosed. At the top there, University of Florida, they had a scientist who was well-funded by NIH, who was the vice president of a university in China and was essentially using his time at the University of Florida to run this university in China. Another case involves the chair of chemistry at Harvard, who has been charged with lying to federal government officials about his ties to Chinese institutions, and he's also been indicted on tax evasion charges, or false tax claims. We've had scientists who have had jobs in China, such as the Emory person down below, who were making substantial amounts of money. The person at Emory had made at least $500,000 in personal income that was deposited into Chinese bank accounts, never reported to Emory, never reported to the NIH, and never reported to the IRS. He wound up pleading guilty to filing false tax forms. Next slide. One of the manifestations that we've seen is that people lie on grant applications about their foreign affiliations and about their foreign grant support. This case involved an endowed chair professor at Ohio State University, Sanggu Zhang. He had received over $4 million in NIH support and had failed to disclose multiple affiliations that he had in China. He was running shadow laboratories in China, and essentially what he was doing was he was using the NIH money to develop expertise in the Chinese lab, and it manifests itself through frequent lies on NIH grant applications. So this led to a guilty plea. This case isn't over yet. It's still awaiting sentencing. But I think one of the key points here is that lying on a grant application is potentially a crime. And actually, when university officials make an attestation on a grant application, they say that everything there is true, complete, and accurate. In part, true, complete, and accurate to the best of the knowledge of the PI, and that failure to submit information that's true, complete, and accurate could lead to prosecution on an 18 U.S.C. 1001 basis, as well as others. Okay, next. This case just came out a month or so ago, although we've been working on this case for a long time. So this is a University of Florida researcher who had received $1.75 million in NIH money. The next slide illustrates what was going on with him. So next slide, please. So his name is Lin Yang, and what he did was he was doing informatics research. That's what he was being funded for at NIH. So he established a business in China known as Deep Informatics. The indictment alleges that Yang promoted his business in China by relating that its products were the results of years of research supported by millions of dollars of US government funding. Simultaneously, Yang applied for and was accepted into the People's Republic of China 1,000 Talents program in connection with Northwestern Polytechnic University located in Shan, China. Now, so he had a business. He was promoting products that were based on work that had been conducted at the University of Florida, that belonged to the University of Florida, and that were paid for by the US government. This is what the indictment alleges. And then in addition to that, the 1,000 Talents Award he had was at a university that has close ties to the Chinese military. We've become aware of a large military civilian fusion program whereby civilian research is being used for military purposes. So it's possible here, and we are aware of other cases as well, that NIH, which is an agency that is interested in funding health research, may have been inadvertently supporting research that was being conducted on behalf of the Chinese military. Okay, next. This is a case also that was reported out in the news. Well, it's been coming out over the last few months, but this story came out also about a month ago. So two researchers who, as postdocs and then as staff scientists, have been supported on a number of NIH grants. They worked as staff scientists in a laboratory at Nationwide Children's Hospital, also in Ohio. What they were doing was it was a couple, a husband-wife couple, and they were setting up companies and getting patents in China. They were essentially taking the technology that was being developed in this American laboratory and taking it over to China. Both of them pleaded guilty, the husband and the wife. The wife, Dr. Chen, was sentenced to 30 months in prison and ordered to pay $2.6 million in restitution. The husband, I believe that sentencing hasn't taken place yet. Now, what's particularly striking was the victim impact statement. So if we go to the next slide, the victim impact statement was written by David Brigstock, who's the PI of that laboratory. And he talks about how they discovered that Li Chen had been involved in multifaceted covert efforts to privately monetize our technology by filing patent applications, forming companies, receiving funding, and working with third parties without my or Children's Hospital's knowledge or approval. But then he goes on and he says that part of the reason why this was so devastating is that, in his view, Li Chen was more than just an employee. Our lives intersected in and out of the work environment. She was a trusted colleague, out of which had grown a close personal friendship. I think this makes her crimes even more reprehensible because she exploited her closeness to me and others in my group to effectively conceal her wrongdoing for many years. Okay, next slide. So this is a big problem. I've presented to you a few cases, but we're dealing with hundreds of cases of people who have failed to disclose substantive foreign affiliations, foreign grants, foreign contracts, significant financial conflicts of interest, peer review violations. This is not just an NIH problem. This is a all of government problem. In fact, well, I'll talk about it in just a second. this is something that we're working closely with many government agencies on. There's been quite a bit of outreach on this. This was an event that took place at the University of California on January the 26th. We've been working very closely with OSTP, which released this recommended practices document in January of 21. This is a document that a number of us, and I'm one of the co-authors of this, have been working on for years to help institutions understand the nature of the threats to their research and to their IP, and to help them to address it in a way which is effective, but at the same time maintaining openness and collaboration, which is such a critical part of our ability to conduct science. And next. And in fact, only this morning, in fact, only a few hours ago, I participated in this symposium, which is being hosted by RPI. It involves, there were like 150 people or more involved on this particular event. We had a panel that involved me, Rebecca Kaiser from the National Science Foundation, Bindu Nair from the Department of Defense, and John Demers, who is one of the Assistant Attorneys General. And we were discussing the nature of this problem. So this is a big problem, which is continuing to get a lot of attention and causing a lot of worry. Okay, next slide is my final slide. So these are some closing thoughts here. One is that research integrity is not just a matter of bad apples or rogues. It is a matter of institutional. It's an institutional matter, and so part of our efforts involve outreach to institutions and leveraging reputational risk for institutions to help create an environment of research integrity and accountability. I think data and data sharing will be an important part of the environment. As many of you may know, NIH is in the process of implementing a data sharing and management policy. The idea being that much more data should be shared, and we think this may help to nurture an environment of integrity. In some cases, we do pursue legal actions, and Duke would be perhaps one of the more prominent cases. We work very closely with lots of other people, with RIOs, with the Office of Research Integrity, with the Office of General Counsel, with the Office of Civil Rights, with Office of Inspector General, with the FBI, DOJ, NSF, many other agencies as well. We train our staff. And I suppose one thing we could talk about during discussion is what kind of actions can institutions take to promote a culture of integrity and a culture of security, so that we're dealing with fewer and fewer bad apples as time moves on, and we're able to mitigate the effects of their actions before they cause too much harm. So I hope you found this interesting, and again, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today.